Thank you, Brian. That was very generous. And thank you, Mahoko, for helping arrange this book talk. And thank you to Books and Books for hosting. It's such a pleasure to have an independent bookstore in town, and it's really a gem for all of us. So thank you also for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to be able to share my research with you. Hopefully we'll have some interesting conversation. I'm not going to speak for too long. I want to try and give you a little bit of a insider view on the book and how I came to be able to figure out some of the things that I say. And then we'll open it up for your questions about anything and everything Maya or archaeology. I was thinking about this today, and I didn't know how much I wanted to try and cover what's in the book, and I thought instead maybe I would talk about how archaeologists happen to even talk about such things as social identities. It's kind of a big leap in some ways. So first, let's talk about what a social identity is. Let's see if this works. Yeah. Okay, so I can't see the screen from there. So, all right, so social identities as I define them, and this is a topic that, as Brian said, is something that social scientists in general are interested in, humanists, of course, as well. The ideas that we hold and relationships that we form to explain difference and to navigate social interactions. So we do this along lots of axes. Many of us are familiar with the idea that we're going to come up, we identify ourselves based on gender, we maybe identify ourselves based on national origin, on race, etc., lots of different things. But the point that the angle I wanted to take in the book was that social identities are really the result of a dialogue that happens between people and places and objects that are not inherent, they're not something that is unchanging, but they evolve, they intersect with other identities. And so we can see that as a process that unfolds over the course of a lifetime, over the course of a culture's history, in lots of different ways. And we form these communities around these different axes. So I threw in the picture there of, does anybody know what's going on? Drinking, but who is it and where? Where is the important part? This is this is Obama in Ireland, and the Irish claim Obama, right? This is part of the ongoing conversation about Obama's ethnicity. The Irish are very proud of the fact that he's 1/8 Irish, and claim his Irish. So if you're in Ireland now, you see pictures of Obama everywhere as one of the Irish presidents of the United States of America. And so clearly that's a conversation that's happened. That's not something that was necessarily something obvious to all of us, or maybe even to Obama himself before he went, but it's a way that people connect with one another, and it's also a way that we explain how we are different. So both forming those groups and forming the separations between groups. So let me back up for just 1 second, because my mom wisely reminded me that I should explain why I even wanted to write this book. So now that you know what social identities are, I want to tell you that a lot of archaeology is about very basic data recovery. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out the date of what we've found and figure out what it is we're actually looking at, piecing together little pieces of things to figure out if it's a human bone or a deer bone or something like that. Over time, over the 15, 20 years that I've been working in the Maya area, I saw these patterns emerge, and I wondered why nobody was really asking a whole lot of questions about this. So there's been interest in things like gender and how you can see that in the archaeological record in other parts of the world, and people who are working in Europe primarily, but not so much where I work, because there is a constant fascination with finding the new flashy tomb, which are very, very interesting. The tombs and the artifacts that are in those tombs are spectacular in the Maya area, but they to a certain extent override a lot of the questions about the basic 99% that's out there, right? So I wanted to get to that 99%, and I thought, why do we even study archaeology? Well, one of my professors when I was in grad school, a very famous Mayanist named Michael Coe, he said, every archaeologist sees either a glass half full, glass half empty. You either see the commonalities that you have with the ancient culture that you're studying, or you see the differences. And those motivate you in different ways to ask different kinds of questions. I'm one of those people who always sees the commonalities. I'm interested in what's the common experience that I have with somebody who lived 2,000 years ago. And I know there's a lot of differences. Obviously, there's a lot of differences. But I'm interested, or I connect, or I am inspired by the commonalities. So social identities are something that we all experience as well. They're a very, very active part of our life. And I thought, if we could really get to the social identities of ancient cultures, we would kind of have a place to connect. Sorry, I'm going to. All righty. Okay, 1, 2. All right, so social identities are, let's just stick with the Obama theme here. This is a portrait, obviously, in a state function where both Michelle and the president are sort of performing their official functions, obviously as political leaders, but they're also performing gender roles. Michelle's known for her fashion sense and her beauty and her health and her initiative on those fronts. She's not really, we don't really discuss her legal career or her legal degree very much. It falls somewhat on the edges of the way that we think about the First Lady, right? So this is an example of the way in which in our country today we have an idea about what gender means, and especially gender at that level of sort of visibility and authority. It means something fairly specific in beauty, style, grace, leadership, assistance and support of the president. It doesn't necessarily mean somebody who has an active career, who might be arguing in front of the Supreme Court, et cetera, which are all characteristics of Michelle as well, but they don't really get portrayed a lot. On the lower right, you see an image from a classic Maya vase, which is also a portrait of two leaders, a male and a female leader in classic Maya times. This would have been painted on a cylinder vase, and that was a gift from one elite to another, and maybe they drank some spicy chocolate out of it. But it also shows, for that culture, sort of idealized versions of what an elite male and a woman would do. So in that scene, you see a king and a queen seated on a throne, receiving guests, receiving dignitaries, talking to those dignitaries, and performing the functions of leadership in their state. So this is really to illustrate the fact that we all are affected by social identities. We all create ways in which we identify. We have both the official, formal idea of what we should be, and then we have the reality of the lived experience, right? So for Michelle, the official, formal identity that she performs of being the First Lady is a relatively narrow slice of her life, right? Draws on a relatively narrow, I would say narrow aspect of her full being. But it's still meaningful. It's not as if it's not meaningful. It's just one component of her. That's what social identities are. It's not to say that they fully encompass and fully represent the diversity of you, but they are a set of guidelines by which you can function and find commonality with other people. So other cultures have them just as we do, and this is one of the connecting points we have between us and the past, and I feel it's really useful to kind of erase that arbitrary difference we have. Could somebody just hit the forward button? That difference we have between the past and us. There's really not a firm line there. Okay, so how do you get from little tiny pieces of pottery, broken pottery or whatever, to concepts of gender and what it means to be female? That's kind of the leap. I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of the insider story on that. So these are just some examples of my work if you go forward. All right, so within the realm of anthropology, often we teach in our classes that archaeology is the study of material culture. Anthropology is the study of human culture. It takes a lot of different forms. You have linguists who study language, cultural anthropologists who study modern societies. You have archaeologists who study material culture, both of the past and the present, and physical anthropologists who study our human origins. Now, the question, though, is what is material culture, right? Often archaeology can be sort of stereotyped to be stuff. We're looking at the cool stuff that people made. And in truth, we often do have a lot of cool stuff to show you. But the point that we're trying to get to when we talk about cool stuff is what is the idea behind that stuff, right? So material culture is really a manifestation of culture, just like language is a manifestation of culture, just like wedding ceremonies are a manifestation of culture. So there really isn't a difference in looking at material culture if what you're trying to get to is the idea behind the material culture. So this is an illustration which from Jeffrey Fox, who's a famous photographer, who's really done a lot of beautiful photography in the Maya area. I wanted to show because that is a crazy huge ceramic pot that man is carrying, right? It's beyond conception that's a reasonable vessel to carry, to fill with water, first of all, and then to carry, right, for one person. But obviously within his culture, it makes sense. If you're going to have to walk 3 hours to get water, maybe you want to get as much water as you physically can, and that's the way you do it, right? There's no wagon and there's no horse, so you design a way in which an individual human can do it. So the idea behind that pot is what we're trying to get to in archaeology. Not the actual pot. The pot's cool, and it helps us get started, but what we really want to know is, why does that person think that's a reasonable idea, right? And that's kind of where we can start to get into the realm of the mind. We're really trying to always think about ideas rather than just stuff. Okay, so, and then this is Basic Archaeology 101, just to fill you in again on the secret process by which we figure this out. So we look for the material patterns. The red pottery is always in the domestic structures, and the white pottery is always in the ceremonial grounds. We know that those patterns reflect repeated behavior, right? The fact that there's all these books in here and that there's a cash register there means there's repeated behavior. People come in, they know where to find the books, they know where to pay, right? It's a repeated pattern that happens over and over again. We all have these repeated patterns in our lives. We know where to find the Starbucks. We know where we parked our car, hopefully. We know what to wear in certain situations because it's a repeated behavior. The repeated behaviors come from cultural beliefs. The fact that we drink coffee in the morning is a repeated behavior. It's part of our culture. We think that that's a normal and appropriate thing to do. The fact that we come to events like this in the evening as opposed to the morning, it's a cultural belief. It's just one of the things, the way we've organized our day around work and then entertainment, broadly speaking, in the evenings, it's a cultural practice, right? So this is how we get from potsherds, which are the residue, right, of repeated behaviors, to cultural belief. Okay, and so through these patterns of material stuff, we can start to draw conclusions about belief. And so that's how in the Maya area, I can argue in the book that there is a very clear association between ideal masculinity and the ball game. Right? So the Maya had a very ceremonial ball game that they played at the elite level, right? Probably young men from the royal dynasties would compete. We think that two dynasties maybe would compete against each other. Maybe visiting dynasties would compete with hosts. It's portrayed in lots of different media. So on the left, you can see the actual physical structure of that ball game. They're located right in the middle of downtown, right next to a palace, right next to a big temple. So clearly, they're super important for that reason. They're restricted access. Not everybody can get in there. This isn't a stadium. This is something that maybe a few hundred people could witness. And we see them portrayed in figurines so that we know that it's like almost ridiculous amount of stuff that they wore. We find these, some of those belts, they actually wore carved stone belts as well as cotton padding. We see the actual game portrayed on the ceramic paintings. This is another one of those cylinder vases the image has been rolled out for us. You can see that the ball players are very elaborately dressed. They have on crazy hats. They have on all kinds of other regalia, and they're trying to hit this giant rubber ball, which probably weighed. It was a solid rubber ball, which we found archaeologically probably weighed 100 pounds. And even really elaborate media, like this carved stone panel on the lower right, portrays the same thing. This is the kind of panel that would have been in a palace. You would have seen it as you walked into the reception area, that maybe a king would have hosted guests, and that basically identifies this activity as something that was very key, very important for leaders of state. We don't see any women portrayed as ball players. We know that we can see in the skeletons of royal men that they had injuries consistent with ball playing. It's clearly something, and even in the colonial period mythology of the Maya area, there's descriptions of the mythological hero twins who are kind of the blueprint for what's considered ethical behavior who were ball players, right? And they went to the underworld and they defeated the gods of the underworld, and this is a script for life. So ball games, masculinity, very closely interlinked. Not all masculinities, but the dominant, elite, or hegemonic sort of masculinity, the official state-sanctioned masculinity, right? Obviously, there were lots of other masculinities in play as well. We see shamans, we know that there were elderly men, we know there were children who were not yet considered men, all sorts of other masculinities are in operation, but this is the sort of state-sponsored message about what is considered important and valuable about masculinity. And it connects in then with warfare and other sorts of things. And likewise, we can see that there's also a state-sponsored message about women, and elite women in particular, and their connection to cloth production, very elaborate cloth, not just blue jeans and t-shirt, but super elaborate cloth. So the figuring on the right, it's a little dark because of the light, but she's holding a giant skein of hand-woven, hand-spun thread, right? The figure on the far right is a very famous panel, again from a palace. This would decorate the entrance to a palace, which shows a woman in a very elaborate textile dress, right? So she can see her kneeling on the ground. She's actually in the midst of summoning a vision serpent there so she can communicate with her ancestors before her husband goes to war. But the point of this, of using the image here, is that her dress is very important. She's not just shown in anything. She's shown in the most elaborate kind of woven textile that can be made. And fortunately, we know a lot about the woven textiles of the classic period, not from their preservation, because unfortunately in the tropics, we never get anything like that, but from colonial descriptions and the techniques that are still used today, in Guatemala in particular. So super elaborate kinds of weaving techniques. The figurine shows the same thing. The women on the lower left, who are shown in a palace scene, are all wearing different colored, elaborate clothing and dress. And this extends even to the burials of women. So what you see on the top center image are a set of bone needles that would have been used for embroidery and also for embellishing woven textiles. And those were found with the queen's burial. Many, many queens, royal queens in the Maya area, are buried with either jade spindle whorls or jade needles or carved bone needles or some, super abundance of those too, like 50 bone needles, way more than any one person would need. But again, because they are the queen or that elite level, their message has to be kind of over the top, right? Michelle doesn't just dress stylishly. Michelle wears designer clothing to demonstrate her access to a certain level of quality and of really the idea of what it means to be a stylish woman, right? And the same thing was going on in the past, where the elite were kind of going over the top with their message. They don't not just including their own little weaving basket, they're including 50 examples because they can, right? Conspicuous consumption. Okay, next. So this is where we start to get a pattern between the stuff that people use and their ideas about the stuff. Why did they even create this stuff? They create it because they think that it's important for women to convey their natural ability to be productive with cloth, to create beautiful cloth. It's not that there's no man who ever wove cloth or that every woman was a super skilled textile artist. But the message that's conveyed is that women have this ability, and this is an important and valuable ability. Right? Okay, so just to orient anybody who hasn't been to the Maya area, I like to include this because it shows you how close we are to the Maya area, and this is actually one of the big motivations for me. I grew up in Florida. I got all the way into college before I even knew that there was such a thing as a Maya civilization. I took a class and I was like, holy smokes, I'm like right across the Gulf of Mexico from this incredible place that I didn't know anything about. And how does that happen? That's not good. So I got fascinated with a professor who taught on the Maya and had grown up in Mexico. And so I've spent my whole career working there. Next. And there's some date range there. Okay, so I want to just talk a tiny bit in the time we have left about one of the chapters. The book looks at a few different kinds of social identity because there was a period in time in which we really just kind of focused on people's a single identity. But all of you know that you have multiple identities, right? These are things that don't exist solely. You're not defined solely by a single characteristic. So I am both a mother and a female and somebody who lives in Miami, and a white person, and somebody whose family's from the Midwest, right? At all of these different simultaneous, somebody works for UM, so I didn't wear any UM branded stuff here tonight, but that was one of the thoughts I was going to do. Anyway, all of these things simultaneously intersect, right? And that's kind of where we're at right now looking in archaeology. So the book then tries to say, here's different forms of social identity we can look at and how we find them in the archaeological record. I start off talking about Chunchukmil and how people had a sense of coming from a particular city, so that there were certain things about that city that were repeated over and over again in every neighborhood and every household, that kind of ends up giving you a sense that it was a place that people lived, and it was an unusual kind of place. It's kind of like every city has a different character, right? And this one had a pretty clear character that was different than others because it didn't have the agricultural basis. Then I talk about memory and how we use memory to create identity, and the sense that we forget things that we don't want to keep as part of who we are. So in the United States, we're constantly talking about, well, I am in my classes, constantly talking about how we forget about the Indian Wars removal period. You know, we just had homecoming and the Iron Arrow people, and we have to walk the students through the fact that the Seminole Wars made it possible for a place like Miami to exist, right? So we removed a whole many different cultures of indigenous people in order to take this land. It's not something that really is part of our regular consciousness about who we are when we think about what it means to be American. So we forget in order also to create identity. And then there's another chapter that talks about gender and how space is very gendered in Maya culture, as it is in a lot of places. So that the domestic world is a place where women are understood to be naturally proficient, and the civic area is a place where men were understood to be naturally proficient. Again, not that there was never a man who was a cook or a woman who was a queen, because we know those examples exist, but the way the power was structured was that there was an understanding of sort of an inherent natural abilities. And then one of the other chapters, the final chapter that's really kind of focused on a specific identity, talks about age-based identities and how we understand the difference or the transition of child to an adult, right? A child is a really interesting social identity because it's something that everybody experiences, but it's transitory, right? So it's not something that we hold on to unless the child dies, in which case we have a permanent kind of record of what that identity was. But basically, it's one that we all experience, and then we help perpetuate from the outside. So once we're adults, we have our memories of what it meant to be a child, and we create that then with new children, right? We reproduce it over and over again. So how could you possibly understand how a child was conceived in ancient Maya culture? And this is another thing that's kind of interesting to me, is obviously children are not thought of in the same way in every culture and time. Even in our own society today, we have a very recent definition of childhood as carefree and irreplaceable, and a time of essentially no responsibility. How long have we had that conception of childhood?
100 years.
At the most, right? Probably, I mean, my grandfather started working when he was 4. So there's a whole lot of, maybe just 1 or 2 generations past, children were at work very, very young in this country. So very different conception, not necessarily based in biology, which is one of our assumptions, I think, about childhood, is that children are incapable because they're so small and unformed. However, if we just look at our own very recent history, children did a huge amount of work, right? So very capable in lots of ways. So this is just to point out that cultures define childhood in really different ways, and we can't assume that every culture is going to think of them as carefree, as the period of youth as carefree and without responsibility. And in fact, in the Maya world, and these are some more of Jeffrey's photographs, it is very much characterized by specific work responsibilities, very gender-specific work responsibilities. So starting once a child is weaned around age 4, they have to start watching out for their little siblings, and then the girls have a lot of domestic chores in terms of caring for animals like that little pig or chickens, and learning how to weave and learning how to cook and fetching water. And the boys have also a separate set of responsibilities where they are having to go out and help with planting and harvesting and learning about plants and the forest and the road and kind of doing stuff outside the house. So very specific and different patterns today. And I've looked at that in the past and seen how far back those go in the past. So the book talks about how one of the ways in which we could understand ancient childhood, is just one, is through burials. So you could look at toys that children played with. Maya didn't get into toys, so that's a whole concept in and of itself, when toys emerge, and the concept of toys. You could look at the work that children did, and that's an interesting thing also. The shellfish gathering, for example, children can do that and still do that. But burials are an interesting and particular kind of way to look at identity. When you're looking at a burial, obviously you're not just looking at what that person felt about themselves, right? What are you actually looking at? Who creates the burial?
Family.
Right, the survivors, the family, the adults, whoever is in charge of that place. So you get the outsider view, but it's a very deliberate one, right? Burials are something that have to be very consciously planned. Rarely are they accidental or sort of inept or unplanned. So burials are an interesting way to look at identity formation because they get you into the idea that whatever it is people had in their head that they want remembered, right? We all have been to funerals of family members we didn't particularly necessarily, maybe we weren't that close, to put it nicely, right? But the funeral is still something we go to, and we still dress up, and we still perform the whole ritual, right, of going along with it because that's what you do. So this is an interesting thing about funerals. So in the book I talk about how there were, I'm looking at about 50 burials from these different sites I've worked at from a couple 100-year period, and they always follow a certain pattern. They're either, the very, very small, the infants are buried in these large ceramic urns that you see a photograph of, a model of one there, and those urns are then put into fairly large architecture. So on the lower left, you see one of those buildings. It's a small temple, all right? So when that temple was built, it had this urn placed in it, which had the body of an infant and then a few other things as well, a couple shell beads, sometimes a little bit of jade, sometimes some deer bone. And this is a pattern that's repeated over and over again. So a little bit older children are buried actually in the home, usually under the floor, just like the adults were. Same kinds of stuff. Deer bone, little piece of deer bone, not an entire deer, maybe a little bit of shell ornaments, and a little bit of jade. And then there's a third pattern, which are those children who were sacrificed by being thrown into a well. And there's a lot of good data on that from one particular well in the northern lowlands that I use, and I make this argument that the other things that are thrown into the well, not trash, not slaves, not people who were sick, but gold objects, which came all the way from Panama, turquoise objects, which came all the way from Arizona, incense, resin incense that came from the rainforest, precious objects, in other words, jade beads, shell objects. So I make the argument in other publications as well as in this book that the children were not offered because they were expendable, but rather because they were precious. If you look at the pattern of what's offered, it's all objects which are very, very precious and very, very inherently precious. Like they have an inherent worth. So the Maya thought jade and gold and turquoise all had an inherent value and power to them. It's not just from currency or an exchange, but that the nature of those things was special. And that's part of what's going on with the way that children are portrayed in death as well. So the connection with the shell's another very precious object. Even though the Yucatan Peninsula is not very large, people at the sites I was working at are not eating marine products. They are 100% corn eaters. They're not going to the coast to harvest shellfish or conch. They may eat some dried fish that's traded in, but probably not at some of the sites I'm working at. It's a very, very different domestic base, and we know that by looking at bone chemistry. So shell, then, in other words, even though it's relatively plentiful, is still exotic. It's still different. It's still something that's not just a food remain or trash. It's a really precious sort of material. And through lots of different lines of evidence, I talk about how the sea is an origin place for the ancient Maya, that the Maya thought of themselves as coming from the sea, and that the sea was a place of wealth and riches and bounty. And the underworld was portrayed as a watery place as well. So when some of the tombs of kings and queens, they're laid out with shells and other ornaments which make it clear that they're going under the sea. Right? They're going under the water into the underworld. So infants, given that they're coming back from the land of the ancestors and land of the other world, also then have a very close, intrinsically close relationship with the sea. And I think that that's part of why the shell is used. The image in the center is a photograph of a shell ornament that we excavated from one of the child burials. It's actually very beautiful when it's cleaned up. That's right when we found it, so it's all still dirty, but it's a single piece of conch that's been carved in a mask, would have been worn as a pectoral. So shell being one of the most common things that's buried with children, I think, is a clue to us that there was a connection between the young and other objects that came from the sea being a source of plenty and wealth and a connection to the ancestor world. So I think I want to, there's another, okay, so we may just leave that there and open this up for discussion. If you have any questions, anything about the book or the approach or otherwise. I know I kind of ran through a lot of stuff there, but. Okay, good. How are we doing on time, Victor?
Always tough for the first hand to go.
Yes.
How do the local people and community view your research? How much do they want to know?
Great. Thank you for asking that question. The question is, how do the local Maya feel about the work, and how much do they want to know about the work? I am actually extremely fortunate to work in an area where the local population is very, very interested in archaeology and in their own ancient past. And all the different sites that I talk about in the book, I've had different relationships with the local populations, but in all of them there have been very sizable local Maya populations who work with us on the project, on the site, and then who we collaborate with on the interpretation. So in Mexico, they're not small rural schools, and most of the people in these villages have had a 4th grade education at the most, because that's what the schools provide, unless they travel to another town to do junior high and high school, which is great, very expensive for them. That curriculum is set by the state, and it's very Mexico City centered. They learn about the Aztecs, but they don't know anything about Maya culture. So when we began working at Yaxuna, where I work now and where I worked for my dissertation, like the ethnographers of the 1930s and 40s, when they asked the Maya about the sites, the Maya people there today would say those were a different race of people. That was made by somebody that's not us, that's somebody else. But the longer we have worked there and the more they see the houses are exactly the same design, the floors are made out of the same thing, the people are eating corn, they're using grinding stones which are exactly the same as their grandparents, the modern people's grandparents, the objects, the ceramics are the same, they say, wow, maybe we got something in common here. And so they are particularly fascinated by the similarities as well, and they're really interested. There are lots of other complicating factors in the sense that, for example, we can't leave the materials that we find in the villages where we dig. They have to be turned over to state authorities, and that's a 20-year learning experience, I would say, in terms of trying to negotiate other avenues or other mechanisms for them to have access to the material. But in general, they're very interested. Yes, sir?
How would you, the interesting thing about the different phases of childhood, do you have any idea, or maybe you can expand on how sort of those different burial traditions for neonates or infants versus young kids versus older kids, like what are the events that you see as sort of dividing, or the phases of childhood that you see represented there, and childhood identity?
Yeah, so the question is, can we see different phases of childhood or in a sense of different phases of childhood in the material evidence? And I think we can. I think others have pointed out the giant oyas that the infants are put into for the burials kind of resemble a pregnant womb. I mean, it's not a big leap to go there with that. And then the fact that those are then deposited into a building also seems to resemble something like a reverse of the birth process. If you look at the contemporary cultures, there's a very clear distinction between 0 and 4. Those are the kids who are left really they're never off the mom's body, really. there, and they have nurse at will, and they're carried in a pack, and or they're left in a hammock tied up for somebody to watch. At 4, they're weaned. It's a very dramatic process because usually their mom's about to have another baby, and so they start eating corn. And the Maya today define a person as somebody who eats corn. So prior to eating corn, there's not a real sense that person is a person. Like it's a process of solidifying over those first 4 years. High infant mortality, of course, contributes to this. People don't bond necessarily right away in the same way because of high infant mortality. But more importantly, I think, is the sense that there's something that in the nature of that diet that they eat that makes somebody a human. Prior to that, they're kind of more of the spirit world. And there's a lot of purification ceremonies that children go through in that 0 to 4 range, as well as the moms, that all kind of help, again, solidify the person, the new person, infant person here on the earth. Then from 4 to 10 is a very specific range of lots of new responsibilities that are very gender specific, like I said. And then around 10, or the beginning of adolescence, there's less common contact. So they start to split people into 2. So I think we see in the archaeological record almost the same thing happening. There's a clear treatment of infants in a certain way, and then there's a clear treatment of small children in another way. In terms of the kinds of goods that I didn't mention, one of the things that's interesting about Maya burials of children is that the children are buried exactly the same way adults are buried. They're buried in the same locations, and they have the same kind of artifacts. And for people who are studying childhood, this is a significant fact because not every culture in the world buries children in the same way that they bury adults. Some cultures, obviously, if the child's born and is never baptized, the child can't be buried in a church ground. Or if the child is born and not given a name, they have to be buried somewhere else. Or children in general are segregated from the cemetery, which is only for full adults. And so these all reflect, again, different ideas about what it means to be a child. But in this society, they are buried in the same places usually. Yes?
When you study the city that was there, and you say it was a trade city, a lot of high population. Now when you look at what's there, the people that are there now, it looks like they're more rural, agricultural. Mm-hmm. Do you get to study like the transition of what happens when a city like that disappears in a way, trade changes, and then it goes to agricultural, and what happens?
Yes, we do actually. The questions about what happens to Chinchik which is this big trade center in the classic period, but then now is basically an agricultural center. It's not even a good agricultural center. It's really what goes on there today is that people live there, but that they leave all week and work in the capital a couple hours away, and then they bring their money back to town because it's so poor for agriculture. Well, that would be studying the colonial period, which is a huge topic. But even before that, what happens in Chinchik is very interesting because the reason it was successful is it was tied into a network across all of Mesoamerica. So there was a very big and powerful city in central Mexico, around Mexico City, called Teotihuacan. If any of you have been to that site, it's a spectacular place that influenced the entire region for about 400 years. And so, like a lot of peninsulas, Yucatan is very interesting, and it goes through these phases where the style was to be from outside the peninsula for a few hundred years. If you had ties to Teotihuacan, you were the thing. You were happening. And so all the kings build buildings that look like Teo, and they all copy in local clays the pottery from Teotihuacan, and they change their diet, etc. And then at a certain point, Teo actually kind of crumbles and falls apart. It's possibly attacked and burned, but basically it no longer is the thing. And then everybody goes back to being very much from the peninsula and very focused just on Maya stuff. And then that changes again another 400 years later when Chichen Itza grows. And Chichen Itza is all about stuff from outside the peninsula again, and how you get legitimacy by being connected into ideas from outside. So it ebbs and flows. And so Chinchik fortunes were tied to Central Mexican trade and trade in goods that you can only get from that area, and the demand that site had for the salt that Chinchik provided. Yes?
Could I follow up on that and ask a little more about the range of the networks? You mentioned Arizona, the Southwest, and as far down as the Amazon. Could you say a little bit about the range of the connections?
Yeah, the range of the connections in ancient Mesoamerica. Well, the peak of that is around 1100 AD, and the site of Chichen Itza, which is right in the middle of the peninsula, which rises after most of the other cities have already started to crumble or to unravel, I say. And there's a lot of different debate about why that is, but essentially they've probably just they're played out. I mean, they've been there for 1,000 years. They've lived in the tropics for 1,000 years. They've cut down every tree and plastered every surface. And the kings are not as shiny as they used to be. And so basically people kind of pick up and vote with their feet and leave the cities around 900 AD. Chichen Itza, around 1,000, reinvents the idea of a city and says, hey, let's give this one more go. We've got this new juice from outside. We're plugged into this cult of Quetzalcoatl, and it's all new, and it's all better, and it's bigger. Everything's bigger there. The pyramids are bigger. The ball court's bigger. The trade network is bigger. The economics are bigger. So like a lot of other cities in the Maya area, if you can see the extent of political connection through the extent of the trade. So they don't reach as far as the Amazon, but they do reach as far as Panama for gold, Panama, Costa Rica. And you see in Panama and Costa Rica some of the jade objects that were made in the Maya area that are exchanged in return. And then they did reach all the way up into the American Southwest for turquoise. And you see scarlet macaws being raised in the American Southwest. That originated in the jungles of Mexico. So that, now whether people, I mean, obviously we know that there were connections. It was probably down the line trade. There weren't large envoys that moved into these areas and colonized them, but there was a lot of movement of people, and most of it was waterborne trade. So the canoes that went all around the Gulf of Mexico, and then that Columbus ran into off the coast of Honduras, are part of the same pattern that goes well back in time for that movement of that kind of stuff. Yes?
What was the population of the Maya civilization in the Yucatan Peninsula? How many people lived there?
Well, population estimates are very tricky business in archaeology, but a city like Chunchukmil probably had 40,000 people in it at its height. And it is one of 1,000 cities in the peninsula. They're much, much higher population than lives there today. We'll say that. So the largest Maya cities probably had 65 to 75,000 people at a time, and those people lived there for 1,000 years. And again, there are more cities that we have not excavated than the ones that we have excavated in the Maya area. So there are many, many, many cities that we don't know how big they were exactly. So there were vast numbers of people. Yes,
Were you able to uncover any of the water vessels that were used other than just canoes? Did they advance beyond canoes?
Did they advance beyond canoes? No, that's what we have found. In fact, nobody has really found a full canoe like the ones in Florida, where we were fortunate enough in Florida. A couple of the wooden canoes sunk into the mud of some of the lakes up around Gainesville, and they're preserved very, very well. We haven't found those. What we have found in the Maya area are the paddles, some of those that have been sunk into the mud, and they look exactly like the paddles we see in the art. So we're really basing this on the artistic depictions of the canoes. It would be consistent with the rest of the New World at this time that large carved canoes are the extent of the water travel. So it's close to shore travel. It doesn't seem like anybody's moves into sails or moves into more elaborate rafting or anything like that. But these are canoes, when Cortez runs into the canoe off Honduras, that had 35 people in them. And that was full of goods as well. So they're very large. Large trees that have been hollowed out. Yes?
You mentioned salt. Was there a local source of salt? And was
Right.
the city premised on it?
So what was the story with salt, was the question. Yes, Chunchukmil, the interesting thing about that city, because it was so poor agricultural, such a poor agricultural area, we had to look for other reasons for its large size and its existence. Plus, it's on the edge of a swamp. It's like one of the worst places you could possibly want to live. But it's directly inland from the second largest natural salt works in all of Mexico. So the largest is just a few hundred kilometers up on the top of the peninsula. So in both places, there are these large salt pans where salt just evaporates up out of the ground. And it's very easy to rake it up. People still do that today. They use it for industrial purposes, but it's very low tech and very, very productive. You don't really have to do much at all to it. So it's a seasonal labor now, and it was clearly the same through the colonial period back into time as well. And salt, the thing that's, I think, hard for us to even imagine is that salt was a necessary additive to the diet in the classic Maya period because people were eating almost no meat. So they were eating the complete protein of beans and corn, but neither of those contained very much salt. So you actually had a real health necessity for salt, as well as salt was used for a million other things. So there were various medicinal treatments with salt. Clearly they were preserving fish and other kinds of meat. They were using salt to treat cotton armor, things like that. One last question? Okay.
When you mentioned how, like, when they have very strong, like, gender social constructs, like, you know, women to be in the kitchen doing this, but, like, did they strongly impose that on children as well, or was that, like, children deciding that amongst themselves?
That's a great question. The question is, how much did they impose these gendered roles on children? Well, first of all, let me say that in Mesoamerica, in the indigenous cultures of Mesoamerica, there were more than those two genders. So there were people who were who had the option to perform in a socially acceptable way, neither the masculine or feminine roles that I've described. And those people had specific ritual responsibilities, and gender probably was something that could change over one's lifetime, as it could in Native North American cultures. But yes, every child, even as an infant, infants were given tiny little bows and arrows or tiny little weaving tools, literally when they were a few months old. And those were clearly about, they're not functional, they're about the idea of what the potential for that person to become, right? Then there's a point in time at which the child kind of moves into that more or less. And that's something that I think most of the indigenous cultures in the New World had a more fluid idea about and more options available. But there was a sense that that even as a child, you were given there was an expectation that you would do one of those things. Well, thank you very, very much.
Okay, folks, so if there are no more questions, then we have the book for sale at the counter in the front room over there. Tracy's going to be signing over there at the table to the left of the screen. I want to thank our guest introducers, Professor Suzuki and Professor Page. And please give another hand to Professor Traci Ardren. Thank you very much.
Thank you.